When many people hear the term nationalism, they think of racism, hate, or exclusion, because nationalism has often been co opted by extremists. Professor Barbara Perry, the director of Ontario Tech University's Centre on Hate, Bias, and Extremism, studies extremist movements, particularly white nationalism and far right extremism. We asked Professor Perry about her research and how she distinguishes the nationalist ideas held by extremists from the nationalist ideas held by other groups. This insightful interview with Professor Barbara Perry is from summer 2020. Barb, you are one of the leading experts in Canada on right-wing extremism. And over the last couple of years, I've seen you on almost all Canadian media platforms because I think there's an increased attention and concern about right-wing violence. Could you give us your sense of what the appeal of right-wing extremism is and what the difference between right-wing extremism is relative to other forms of right-wing politics?
Yeah, maybe I'll answer the second question first, and that is to differentiate right-wing extremism from right-wing politics or other forms of thinking. And I think, the term extremism says it all, right? It sort of takes the fundamental notions of right-wing thinking to a logical or illogical extreme, right? To the far end of the continuum, to the right. If we associate the far right with the far right or the right wing with conservatism, a return to traditional values, all of that sort of thing, then right-wing extremists take that a step up and sort of craft it into an exclusionary form of politics, and often quite a virulent one. So I think there's a difference of degree and of kind in the sense of that intensity, if you will, almost the emotional appeals associated with extremism, and it's purely an us versus them sort of dichotomy that's built up on the extreme right, to the extent that they need to be fully contained, if not fully excluded from the broader society. So I think that's really the differentiating point there, is sort of the intensity, if you will, and I think the reactions, the responses, the remedies for all these threats that are posed by the other, if we're talking about sort of racialized notions in particular. And then the other question was about the appeal, and I think some of it's wrapped up there, right, in terms of those narratives. And in times like this, in the midst of the COVID crisis, for example, we're hearing all sorts of conspiracy theories and narratives about who's to blame for this, and whether it's in a crisis condition or not. Those conspiracy theories, those stereotypes, those negative narratives that point the blame at someone else are comforting to those who are, maybe struggling themselves, whether it's, we're talking about incel, and so people struggling to attract women, or whether we're talking about, unemployed white men or youth, the sort of the more mainstream or the more traditional form of right-wing extremism that blames, immigrants for taking our jobs and for sacking our welfare system, that sort of thing. It's very comforting to people. It provides them very neat and tidy explanations for the problems that they might be experiencing, or the conditions that they see around them that might not have any effect on them, but seem to suggest that society's in turmoil, or there's some sense of anomie in the broader culture. Who's to blame for that? Surely it's not us. It must be them.
Yeah. So one of the more common forms of what, at least in my view, what I would call extremist thinking on the right side of the political spectrum would be forms of ethnic nationalism, like white nationalism. And I think that sometimes leads to the concepts of nationalism and extremism being linked, perhaps fairly in some cases and unfairly in others. Do you see those ideas can we separate them cleanly, or do you think they're too interwoven to be easily disconnected?
Well, I think that's why it's important to talk about white nationalism, for example, or racial nationalism, or sort of call it what it is. Provide that qualifier, because I think that nationalism isn't inherently, a problematic construct. It's not automatically a problematic, sort of ideology or set of views. In some respects, I guess I would consider myself a nationalist. If we think about nationalism as meaning, an attachment to the country, an attachment to one's homeland, so to speak. I think where it goes awry is when that becomes an exclusionary concept of the nation. I think of it in terms of nation building and very constructive and progressive. But when we're talking about white nationalists or racial nationalists, they consider nationalism in terms of a very negative and exclusive strategy. So it's a sort of cultural nationalism, which values the nation, but the nation defined in a very narrow way in terms of culture and or ethnicity and or race or language, those sorts of pieces. So that only, that's what they want to preserve, that very unitary kind of nationalism. So to protect those traditional values that they associated with a uniculture, however it is they might define that.
Yeah, so for people who might be nationalists in the more inclusionary way that you described, perhaps they're economic nationalists, or they have a strong sense of patriotism, but they are not interested in narrowly defining who belongs in that vision of patriotism. Are there things that they sometimes, like, the populist types, for example, that we might see on TV? Are there things that they say that you would say might be like, kind of like, could be seen as dog whistles, or like might inadvertently be promoting more extreme thinking or xenophobic thinking, and that they should perhaps be mindful of as how it might echo some of the messaging of extremist groups?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that you do have to be careful about how you conceptualize your own brand, your own variant of nationalism. So, it really does need to be prefaced with the notion of, a strong economy is a challenge. A strong political structure is a challenge if all people aren't given the same opportunities, don't have the same capacity to engage in that economy and contribute to that economy, to engage in that political culture. So I think that that's always got to be front of mind, that notion. And if we go back to the origins of nationalism, of modern nationalism, I guess, if we think about French nationalism in terms of liberté, fraternité, égalité, that sort of, for me, I think encapsulates this more inclusive democratic form of nationalism.
Yeah, and that makes sense, I think. But I would say, I think one of the things you've done in your research and in I think your public voice is show people that right-wing extremism is perhaps more common than some of us might want to think. And I think, for example, your work has pushed the needle on the Canadian government recognizing it as a legitimate threat in some cases, whereas we may not have seen it as a similar type of extremism in past years as we might compare to jihadist violence, for example. Why do you think you've been able to be kind of persuasive, I suppose, on that question? Is it because you bring that nuance around the question of distinguishing extremism from just kind of right-wing politics or other forms of nationalistic messages?
Well, yeah, I think we've certainly tried to do that in our work, is to be a little more delicate in terms of our understanding of nationalism, and trying to be a little more specific in our definition of right-wing extremism in terms of, what are some of the characteristics, what are some of the key narratives that are associated with that movement. So I think that specificity has been important, but I think it's been, also sheer doggedness and refusing to not be heard. So I think that the research has spoken for itself in terms of we have some credibility because of the participants in our research. It's been law enforcement, it's been community-based organizations, and also the voices of those both former and current people who've been associated with the movement, and so know how it works, know what the ins and outs are. But what I think what gives it most credibility, especially amongst law enforcement and security, is the fact this comes from their colleagues. Our observations come from the observations of their colleagues. So I think that's been really important as well, to have quite a holistic approach to the research we do, sort of a 360 in terms of the stakeholders that we engage in the research.
Yeah, that makes sense. I know one of the things you highlight in your work is the role of the internet or social media in spreading some of these ideas and building some of these networks. And I always think of one of the ways that that social media has been effective when it comes to extremism is, as you noted before, the role of conspiracy theories, that they're able to string together a set of data points, whether they're accurate or not, I suppose, is a separate matter, in a way that helps show the value of their worldview, and then kind of present that value proposition to people online. What do you see as the relationship between the extremism that you studied and conspiracy theories, and the role of the internet in promoting those conspiracy theories?
Oh, the conspiracy theories are essential to the movement. They always have been, in terms of right-wing extremism. White supremacy more broadly, I think. They've always been a part of it, in terms of why certain trends emerge, why certain policies emerge, who's to blame. Again, using the most current example of COVID, we've seen by turns both the Chinese government and Israel, or Jews more broadly, held to account for that it is their problem. And it provides a nice, tidy explanation, a very neat one, that this was not just, sort of a natural evolution. Excuse me. Pardon me. This was not just a natural evolution. Some people have tried to tie it to climate change on the left and the right, and that's certainly not something that a lot of right-wing extremists want to hear about. They think that climate change is also, a grand conspiracy on the other side. So I think that it's always been a part. I mean, anti-Semitism in particular has, I think, regardless of who the sort of really visible targets are, whether it was, 10 years ago, Muslims, or, right now, Asians, or, in the Canadian context, Indigenous communities. Anti-Semitism has always been at the base of those hatreds. The anti-Jewish conspiracies have been especially important for uniting the movement across these diverse other kinds of hatreds. So they are really what binds the community together. And the internet, you couldn't ask for a better sort of platform to disseminate them, especially, again, right now, where we're all at home, we're all on our screens. It's a larger audience now that is accessible. So it's a really easy, quick way to disseminate those ideas. And some groups and individuals do it better than others. Some of them are very slick. They look very professional. They look as if their manifestos look as if they're well researched, well cited. The idea is to backtrack through some of those citations, and how legitimate are they? So I think to the extent that they are able to either create these very flashy, very professional looking sites, or to encapsulate those conspiracies into very concise memes, for example, whether that's images or short catchphrases, that has become another way to capture the imagination. Most recently, Boogaloo has become what a flashy name, what a great name, it's catchy, right? Well, peer behind that, and what it means is all out race war. It's not such a friendly kind of comic term after all, but it has some appeal, some sort of visceral appeal.
Yeah. Are you a fan of what seems to be a growing trend of social media companies and tech companies having more like filters and censors over their content. Like, I mean, Twitter was in the news recently for filtering and censoring some of President Donald Trump's material, for instance. And I think that's brought this back up to the surface of, does it actually help to censor these things, or does it just drive some of these thoughts, to the underground and make it hard for us to know what people are saying and thinking?
It's a catch-22, really, right? What we do in terms of social media regulation. On the one hand, we do want to limit the impact and the sort of the wholesale dissemination of these kinds of narratives. We certainly don't want our youth, and because that's one of the other things, right? Is looking at, say, video games and how very mainstream video games can lead down that rabbit hole to right-wing extremists, very violent. Also violent, but racially violent video games as well. I think there is a lot of value in taking down, those kinds of narratives. The music that we see on YouTube, which is virulently racist and misogynistic and homophobic, all of that sort of thing, to limit exposure. But as you say, the downside of that is that they then do create these alternative platforms like Gab and Telegram, for example, that allows them to go, I wouldn't say undetected, because we're still monitoring those kinds of venues, but there are the closed forums. They would go into the closed forums on Facebook or Twitter, Facebook anyway, but nonetheless, now they have their own little spaces, alternative formats and places to go where they feel safe and secure to express whatever it is that they want to plot, to plan, to strategize, whatever might be going on behind closed doors, and much more difficult for researchers, obviously from an ethical perspective, to monitor, and law enforcement as well, unless there is some obvious risk of imminent harm associated with those groups. I'm happy that we've limited the exposure on the mainstream platforms where so many of us live, where youth in particular live. But it would be, we do need to think of strategies to also intervene in those darker spaces that we don't necessarily have access to.
Yeah. One of the arguments that I've seen made by conservatives who are not extremists is that when their political views are deemed extreme unfairly, it will increase the likelihood of people becoming extremists. So for a specific example, and this is something that I've seen come up related to the current COVID pandemic, which is people saying, well, if anytime a right-winger brings up an argument against immigration and we call that racist, then people who want to talk about immigration will then identify with racists, and we will wind up shifting people toward more extreme thoughts by treating certain political positions as if they're extreme when maybe they're actually not. Is that argument, do you buy it? Is that even a legitimate way to think about how our public discourse would affect the likelihood of someone being an extremist in the first place?
I think I see it a little differently, actually, in terms of how it might impact, and I don't necessarily think it brings more people into those conversations on the sort of at the far end of the spectrum. What I think it does is sort of hardens the resolve of those who are already part of the movement. It can. I shouldn't say it does, but it can, because then they use that feeds into that victim mentality, that victim narrative they have. Look, we're being silenced now. We're the ones that are being muzzled and can't speak our mind. I think in terms of, I think the one fear that I do have actually is not so much about people being drawn into the movement, because that's the only place where they can talk about immigration, is just that it can have a chilling effect, and that people become, mean, we're already uncomfortable talking about race. We're already uncomfortable talking about homophobia, transphobia, those sorts of things. And so this is, do we want to add this to the list of conversations that people don't want to have publicly and rationally because they're afraid of how they'll be interpreted. They're afraid of being labeled as racist if they are critical. So I see it more in terms of the potential for its silencing effect than for its mobilizing effect.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. I've never thought about it that way. I think that's a good angle to take on it. In closing, I wanted to ask you about the pandemic and what you think the long-term effects of it are. And I think connected to that for me is also thinking about how the diversity of our population made the COVID conversation different than it may have been otherwise. So, for example, I could imagine that, like, if we did not have a diverse population of people who are from some of the countries where the pandemic may have started, or at least got to before it got to Canada, I think we could have seen a lot more scapegoating of those minority groups. But because when we look around and we see, well, we've got, as far as the Chinese community is concerned, large representation of Chinese Canadians in all of our biggest cities. They're amazing contributors to the country. I feel like that made it harder to scapegoat Chinese diasporic communities at a time when we were seeing that happen in other parts of the world. So does that mean has COVID provided us with some evidence maybe that some of the right-wing extremism might not be as much of a threat moving forward, or do you think that may be overly optimistic?
I hate to be the bearer of bad news here, but I mean, I have seen considerable evidence, in fact, that it's mobilized, right? It has mobilized the far right. Who's been leading the anti-lockdown protests? They've been, very much front and center there. I think more so in the States than here. I haven't seen a lot of evidence yet, but they're in terms of disrupting some of the more peaceful protests and acting as provocateurs, if you will, in some of those contexts. So I think, and I think you also have to put it in the broader context as well, in terms of sort of political culture and how especially what's coming from the South. It was 2016 when we started to see, 2015, 2016 when we started to see the rise of the right, even in the Canadian context, in response to those sorts of enabling narratives that Trump was spouting. And he's crossed more and more lines as he goes along, especially just in this past week. And with the election coming up, another election coming up, we can imagine it's only going to get worse. And I think it's going to, continue to fan the flames that we've seen lit across the world this past weekend. So I don't think we're going to see this problem go away anytime soon. I think COVID, it's not just about scapegoating Asians. It's also now about real economic anxieties. People have lost their jobs. Businesses have closed down, so those jobs are not going to be replaced. I mean, there are a whole series of health risks, economic risks, the harm that it's done to familial relationships in terms of domestic violence when people are secluded as they've been. I mean, all of these pieces are coming together now, I think, in an imperfect storm that are going to, again, enable the far right to exploit this series of crises, this cluster of crises, I don't think we've seen in our memories for sure in the Canadian context. So I'm fearful of more to come down the road, not less.